The day my husband disappeared, there was no note, no explanation, just an empty side of the bed and a silence that stretched on for years. I learned how to survive with unanswered questions, how to build a quiet life around grief that never fully healed. Then one afternoon, long after I had stopped expecting anything, his sister pulled up outside my home in a luxury car I didn't recognize, looked at me with a face full of things she wasn't saying, and simply told me to get in. I didn't know where we were going or what truth was waiting, only that the past I had buried was about to surface again. If this story touches something personal in you, you can quietly support the channel by liking and subscribing for more real-life stories like this. The day my husband disappeared didn't feel dramatic at first, it felt unfinished, like a sentence cut off halfway through, and for years that sense of incompleteness followed me everywhere. He left on an ordinary morning, kissed me on the cheek, said he'd be late, and never came home, and what hurt the most wasn't just the absence, but the silence that came after, the unanswered calls, the explanations that never arrived. I grew up believing that stability was something you built slowly, that if you were loyal enough and patient enough, life would eventually reward you with peace, and my marriage had felt like proof of that belief, quiet, predictable, not perfect but solid. When he vanished, everything I thought I understood about commitment collapsed, and I was left trying to explain his absence to friends, to family, and eventually to myself, without having any answers. His sister was the only one who stayed in touch at first, checking in with cautious concern, but even she grew distant over time, her calls becoming shorter, her questions more guarded, until eventually there were none at all. I told myself she was grieving too, that everyone copes differently, but there was always a sense that something was being left unsaid. As the years passed, I rebuilt my life in small, careful steps, learning how to live with uncertainty, how to stop waiting for a door that might never open again. Yet part of me remained suspended in that moment he walked out, unable to fully move forward without knowing why. I worked longer hours, avoided conversations about the past, and learned how to smile through questions that reopened wounds I had never been allowed to close. Every now and then, I imagined running into him somewhere unexpected, rehearsing what I would say, but deep down, I knew that closure rarely arrives the way we plan. Then, one afternoon, just as I was starting to believe that my story had settled into a quiet, permanent ache, a car I didn't recognize pulled up in front of my house, sleek, expensive, entirely out of place on my modest street. When his sister stepped out, dressed in a way I barely recognized, confident and composed, it felt as if time had folded in on itself, bringing the past rushing back without warning. She didn't ask how I was, didn't explain why she had been gone for so long. She simply looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and said, "Get in." In that moment, 1,000 questions crowded my mind, fear mixing with a strange sense of relief, because whatever she was about to tell me, it would finally break the silence that had shaped my life for years. As I stood there, torn between protecting the fragile peace I had built and the need to understand the truth I had been denied, I realized that this was the moment I had been unconsciously waiting for, the moment when my past would finally demand to be acknowledged. I didn't know whether getting into that car would give me answers or open wounds I had barely managed to survive, but I knew that walking away would mean accepting a version of my life that had always felt incomplete, and that choice weighed heavier than any fear I carried. I didn't ask questions when my sister-in-law told me to get in the car, because by then I had learned that some answers only come when you stop chasing them, and as we drove through unfamiliar streets lined with glass buildings and quiet trees, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes after years of holding your breath. She finally spoke, not to explain, but to acknowledge the silence between us, telling me she was sorry for disappearing, sorry for leaving me alone with so many unanswered nights, and as much as I wanted to demand details, I realized I wasn't ready to hear them yet. We stopped in front of a modest but elegant house, nothing extravagant, but clearly built with intention, and when she opened the door and invited me inside, I felt the weight of the past press gently against my chest. That's when I saw him, older, thinner, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, standing in the living room like someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times and still didn't know what to say. He didn't reach for me, didn't offer excuses, he just looked at me and said my name, and somehow that single word carried all the years we had lost. He told me he hadn't disappeared because he stopped loving me, but because he was drowning in choices he didn't know how to face, family obligations, financial risks, and a sense of failure that convinced him everyone would be better off without him. Listening to him, I felt anger rise, but it wasn't sharp anymore, it was tired, softened by time, and by the life I had built in his absence. I told him about the nights I waited, the calls that never came, the way I had to learn to live without closure, and as I spoke, I understood that this conversation wasn't about repairing what was broken, but about naming it so it could finally rest. His sister watched quietly, tears in her eyes, admitting she had helped him disappear because she thought she was protecting him, never realizing the cost of that protection to me. There was no dramatic apology, no promise to make things right, just a shared recognition that what we had lost couldn't be reclaimed, only understood. When I stood up to leave, he didn't try to stop me, and that was the moment I knew we had both changed in ways love alone couldn't undo. In the car on the way back, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because everything made sense, but because I no longer needed it to. I had spent so long defining my life around his absence that I hadn't noticed how strong I had become standing on my own, and as the city lights faded behind us, I realized that closure doesn't always come from answers, but from choosing to move forward without them.